In the 8th century, somewhere in the imperial workshops of Tang Dynasty China, a group of engineers and court alchemists were working on a problem that had nothing to do with warfare. They were trying to find a cure for skin disease. Following a pharmaceutical tradition stretching back generations, they were experimenting with combinations of minerals and organic compounds, heating them carefully, observing the results, and recording what happened when different substances interacted under controlled conditions. At some point, one particular combination of realgar, honey, and saltpeter was heated directly over an open flame. The resulting reaction was considerably more dramatic than anyone in the room had anticipated. Contemporary texts record that the experiment set fire to the workshop and burned the hands and faces of the men conducting it. Nobody in that room was trying to invent anything that would eventually decide the outcome of battles, dismantle feudal social orders, and reshape the political architecture of multiple continents. They were trying to treat a skin condition. The substance they had accidentally created, which Chinese records call fire drug, was initially classified not as a weapon, but as a hazardous failed medicine, something to be noted carefully in the records and handled with considerably more caution the next time anyone attempted to work with it. That failed pharmaceutical experiment was the beginning of the gun. What those early experimenters had stumbled into was a specific chemical relationship between three ingredients: saltpeter, potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur. When combined in roughly the right proportions and ignited, the saltpeter released oxygen rapidly, feeding a combustion reaction so fast it produced a sudden, violent expansion of gas rather than a gradual burn. That expanding gas is the essential mechanism behind everything that followed, whether the purpose was launching a festival fireworks skyward or eventually driving a metal projectile through armor at lethal velocity. In its earliest documented military applications, this substance was not used to launch projectiles. It was used to produce fire and psychological disruption. Tang Dynasty military engineers in the 10th and 11th centuries developed weapons that used gunpowder primarily as an incendiary, pots and bombs filled with the compound, ignited and thrown into enemy formations or over walls, producing fire and choking smoke rather than any kind of penetrating force. The intent was disruption, not penetration. The conceptual leap from fire to projectile had not yet been made. That leap arrived with the fire lance.
The fire lance was a straightforward weapon in principle and genuinely frightening in practice. Pack a length of bamboo with gunpowder, attach it firmly to the end of a spear, and ignite the compound during close combat. The result was a polearm that produced a sustained jet of flame and burning debris directly at anyone within reach, adding a weapon that projected fire itself to a battlefield tradition built around swords, spears, and arrows. Chinese defenders used fire lances during the siege of Dayan in 1132 against attacking forces scaling their walls. By all accounts, the weapon performed exactly as intended, scorching and disorienting attackers in ways that conventional spears could not. The psychological dimension mattered as much as the physical damage. Soldiers who had spent their lives training to fight with blades suddenly found themselves facing an enemy who could project fire. Once that psychological barrier had been crossed, the next innovation arrived by straightforward logic. Military engineers began packing small pellets and ceramic shards into the bamboo tubes alongside the gunpowder. This transformed the fire lance from a weapon that produced flame into one that also expelled solid projectiles with genuine force, the conceptual foundation of every firearm that would follow. The weapon's purpose had shifted from intimidation and burning to physical, penetrating injury delivered at a distance. The bamboo itself became the limiting factor next. As more powerful gunpowder charges were developed, bamboo tubes couldn't contain the pressure and burst in the user's hands. Chinese craftsmen responded by casting metal barrels capable of withstanding those forces, and the hand cannon was born, a weapon that channeled expanding gas to launch a solid projectile with force and range that no bamboo fire lance could approach. By the early 13th century, metal-barreled hand cannons were in regular military use across China. The mechanism by which this technology left China and eventually reached every inhabited landmass on Earth deserves careful attention because it was not primarily the result of peaceful trade, it was the result of conquest. When Mongol forces invaded China in the 13th century, they encountered Chinese gunpowder weaponry directly during extended siege operations. Rather than being simply defeated by the technology, they absorbed it, studying captured weapons, learning production methods, and incorporating gunpowder devices into their own expanding arsenal. As the Mongol Empire grew and its military campaigns pushed westward into Central Asia and toward the Islamic world, gunpowder technology traveled with them. This represents one of history's more consequential and underappreciated technology transfers, a military campaign that most historians primarily discuss in terms of destruction, simultaneously functioned as a delivery mechanism for an invention that would eventually transform every society it reached. Gunpowder knowledge that had developed over centuries in Chinese imperial workshops was distributed across the breadth of Eurasia within a few generations, not through diplomacy or commercial exchange, but as an incidental consequence of conquest. From the Islamic world, knowledge of gunpowder weapons moved into Europe through multiple overlapping channels: military contact, trade routes carrying technical knowledge alongside goods, and the broader movement of skilled craftsmen across the connected Mediterranean world of the 13th and 14th centuries. By the late 13th century, references to gunpowder weapons appear in European records. Early European cannon designs bear close enough structural resemblance to Chinese predecessors that most historians regard direct technological inheritance as considerably more probable than coincidental parallel invention. What gunpowder did to European military and social organization once it arrived was slow at first and then irreversible. Castle walls that had withstood conventional siege equipment for generations began falling to cannon fire. The vertical stone walls of medieval castle design, built primarily to repel scaling attackers and archers, were poorly suited to absorbing sustained cannon bombardment. Military engineers responded with the Star Fort, a fundamentally different architectural approach using lower, angled, heavily reinforced walls specifically designed to deflect rather than absorb cannon shot. The dominant military architecture of medieval Europe was rendered obsolete within a century or two of gunpowder artillery becoming reliable, replaced by structures that looked nothing like what came before. The heavily armored mounted knight, the most expensive and prestigious military force in medieval European warfare, faced a related problem. Gunpowder-driven projectiles could penetrate steel plate armor that had previously made the armored knight nearly impervious to conventional weapons. A weapon requiring modest training and relatively inexpensive materials could now neutralize an opponent representing decades of training and enormous capital investment. The military advantage that justified the social and economic position of the armored nobility began to erode. But early hand cannons were clumsy, slow, and genuinely difficult to aim. Loading required multiple separate steps, firing required simultaneously managing the weapon and applying a burning ember to a touch hole, and the result still depended heavily on hope that the explosion would go the right direction. The matchlock mechanism, developed across the 15th century, was the first solution that transformed gunpowder weapons into genuine infantry weapons. It attached a slow-burning cord held in a spring-loaded clamp directly to the weapon, designed so that pulling the trigger lowered the burning cord into a priming pan automatically. For the first time, a soldier could hold and aim a firearm properly with both hands, without requiring a separate person to manage the ignition. This sounds like a modest refinement. It was not.
It was the invention that turned the firearm into an infantry weapon capable of aimed fire, something previous designs had never reliably achieved. Matchlock arquebuses spread rapidly across European armies in the early 16th century, and from there outward through the Ottoman Empire's elite Janissary Corps, into Japan via Portuguese traders in 1543, where local craftsmen refined the design to a level European observers acknowledged as exceptional, and eventually back into China itself, which reabsorbed an improved version of its own original invention to use against Mongol incursions along its northern border. The matchlock's persistent weakness was the open flame it required at all times, useless in rain, a liability in darkness, and demanding constant attention even when nothing was happening on the battlefield. The flintlock, attributed to French gunsmith Marine Le Bourgeois around 1610, solved this directly. A spring-loaded hammer holding a shaped piece of flint struck a steel surface to generate sparks directly into the priming charge, faster than a matchlock, functional in poor weather, and requiring no maintained flame whatsoever. By the 1630s, the flintlock had become the dominant infantry weapon across European armies, a position it would hold through the colonial period, the Napoleonic Wars, and the American Revolution. One further development arrived alongside the flintlock's dominance and proved equally consequential: the socket bayonet. Introduced in the late 17th century, attached around the outside of the barrel so a soldier could fire the weapon with the bayonet fixed, combining ranged firepower and close combat capability in a single weapon for the first time. Armies no longer needed dedicated pike formations standing alongside their musketeers for protection. Every soldier carried both functions in one. The logistical and organizational simplification this produced reshaped how European armies structured themselves for generations. The flintlock's reign ended in the early 19th century with the percussion cap, a small metal cap containing a shock-sensitive compound that ignited when struck by a hammer, replacing loose powder, flint, and steel entirely. It was faster, more reliable, and functional in conditions that made flintlocks fail. Within decades, it had rendered every previous ignition mechanism obsolete. Stepping back across the full arc from an 8th century workshop fire in Tang Dynasty China to percussion cap muskets equipping armies in the 1840s, the invention of the gun was never a single moment of insight. It was a chain of problems and solutions extending across 12 centuries, carrying a discovery made by people who wanted nothing to do with weapons through military engineers, Mongol conquerors, Ottoman administrators, Japanese craftsmen, and European gunsmiths who each added one refinement to what arrived before them. Nobody set out to build a firearm. A group of alchemists trying to treat a skin condition accidentally created an explosive compound, noted carefully that it was extremely dangerous, and moved on. Everything that followed, the fire lance, the hand cannon, the matchlock, the flintlock, the percussion cap, and the weapons that descended from all of them, arrived because successive generations of engineers and soldiers noticed a specific problem with whatever version existed in their time and found a specific practical way to address it. The done was not invented, it accumulated. Across 12 centuries, an entire continent, in a chain of people who were almost universally focused on whatever was immediately in front of them rather than on where the chain was eventually going to end.